Last time in our study of the book of Acts, we covered Paul's address before King Agrippa, followed by the beginning of Paul's trip to Rome. Now, even though the journey from Caesarea to Sidon went well, stiff west winds made it very difficult to proceed in the direction that the ship captain wanted to go. And so he was forced to go counterclockwise around the island of Cyprus with great difficulty, causing a significant delay in reaching the port of Myra on the southwest coast of Asia Minor. At that point, the prisoners and their Roman escort boarded a much larger grain ship because they'd been on a smaller ship from the time they'd left Caesarea, but they boarded a large grain ship. However, due to the heavy north winds on the Aegean Sea, it was driven south to the coast of Crete. Now, from time to time today, we will be referring to some maps and maybe some photographs to help you understand a little bit more of what was going on. Anyway, it went to the the east coast of Crete. We concluded last time here in chapter 27 with the ship, this grain ship, anchored in a small bay about halfway across the southern coast of Crete, where Paul warned the Roman centurion, the ship pilot, and the ship captain that attempting to continue on the voyage that they were on would end in disaster. So we're ready now to pick up here in verse 11 of chapter 27. Nevertheless, despite being warned, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner, that is the pilot and the ship captain, than by the things spoken by Paul. Now, since the centurion made the final decision, he was clearly the chief authority on board this ship, indicating that the ship either belonged to or had been leased by the empire, or simply the fact that the centurion was a very high Roman official, and therefore, whatever the captain of the ship, the pilot, was told to do, they would have to obey. His decision, or he based his decision, the centurion did, on the fact that the pilot and the captain of the ship had a lot more seagoing experience than the Apostle Paul had had. Verse 12, New Revised Standard, since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. Now, on our map here of the trip from Caesarea to Rome, we have here in the middle the island of Crete. And we see that this area was fair havens. In addition to the poor shelter afforded in this bay of fair havens here on the map, was the fact that the closest lodging was several miles away. This map is not very accurate. It shows Lasea 30 or 40 miles away, and that's not the case. It was only 3 or 4 miles away, but the map isn't, again, the most accurate that way. The crew now, as we see here in verse 12, joined the pilot and the captain in assuring the centurion that they believed that they could sail the 40 miles further west to the much larger and safer harbor in Phoenix, which again here is to almost to the west end of the island of Crete. Verse 13 goes on in the Revised English Bible, when a southerly breeze sprang up, they thought that their purpose was as good as achieved, and weighing anchor, they sailed along the coast of Crete, hugging the land. But before long, a violent wind, a tempestuous headwind, the New King James has, the nor'easter, or the Euroclydon, as the New King James has, as they call it, swept down from the landward side. So we find that only a few miles west of Fair Havens, looking at the map, you can tell there's a little bit of a curve there just to the west of Fair Havens. but only a few miles from Fair Havens was what was called the Cape Matala. Cape Matala. And there, at that point, the southern coast changes, as you see, from a due west to a west-northwest direction on the map. As soon as they sailed past Cape Matala and entered into the Gulf of Masara, which is not shown on this map, but when that happened, they encountered very, very strong hurricane-force winds. Verse 15 goes on in the Complete Jewish Bible. The ship was caught up and unable to face the wind, or unable to head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed into the lee, or the New King James has, under the shelter of a small island called Cauda, we managed with strenuous effort to get control of the lifeboat. They hoisted it aboard, then fastened cables tightly around the ship itself to reinforce it. So the wind pushed the vessel, this large grain ship, to the southwest somewhere about 23 miles. Now, unfortunately, on this map, we do not have the small island of Cauda shown. But again, it is about 23 miles to the southwest. They received enough protection once they got to that point from the wind that they were able to pull the lifeboat, which was normally towed behind the ship. They were able to lift it up or pull it up on board, on deck of the ship, and secure it, and do whatever then, as it goes on to show in verse 17 here, whatever they could to strengthen the integrity of the hull. Verse 17 continues, fearing they might run aground on the Syrtis sandbars, they lowered the topsails, or they put out a sea anchor, the Revised English Bible has, and thus continued drifting. Now, when you look at the map again, you will see down directly to the southwest of Crete, Cyrenaica, and then to the left of that, the Great Syrtis. Now, the Syrtis sandbars, again, after they were pushed all this way past the small island of Cauda, having no way to ascertain their bearings, they dropped all their sails. It says they lowered their topsail. They dropped all the sails down to slow their southward trek. The Syrtis sandbars, again, Great Syrtis, which constantly changed locations due to strong water currents, were located off the coast of North Africa near the city of Cyrene. Now, Cyrenaica is the province, the Roman province, but Cyrene was right up on the north. The sandbars, the Syrtis sandbars, were north of that. Verse 18, New Revised Standard. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Verse 19, New King James. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle, or gear, or sailing equipment, different translations have. We threw it overboard with our own hands, fearing that they might run aground. They did what they could to lighten the ship so that it would ride as high in the water as possible. Verse 20, Complete Jewish Bible has, for many days neither the sun nor the stars appeared, while the storm continued to rage, until gradually all hope of survival vanished. Without the sun, without the stars, navigation and determining their location was impossible on the open water. Verse 21, New International. After the men had gone a long time without food. Now, all of the massive swells and waves created by the severity of the storm caused everyone on board this ship, no matter how much they had been aboard ships, when it gets that bad, they were all seasick. Everyone on board, and they had no appetite. So they were going a long time without food simply because they didn't feel like eating. Verse 21 goes on, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. Paul had something very important to say, and he wanted to make sure that they paid attention this time and not repeat the same mistake of refusing to listen to him as they had done at Fair Havens. They ignored his advice when he told them, don't continue. Verse 22, New King James goes on, and now I urge you to take heart, or keep up your courage, other translations have, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, saying, or whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those, or the Revised English Bible has granted you the lives of all who sail with you. So Paul told them that everyone on board the ship would survive the coming shipwreck because of what God had in store for Paul. There's some things that Paul had to do, and those men were privileged that they would live because of that. Verse 25 continues, therefore, Paul told them, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me, or turn out it exactly as it was told me, the New American Standard has. However, we must run aground, or Moffat has, we must be stranded on a certain island. Paul passed on the good news from God that the ship would not be torn apart on the open sea, because that's what all of the sailors thought was going to happen, the way it was being pounded. It would not happen, but it would run aground on a certain island, it says. In other words, they would run aground on an inhabited island where they could receive help. That's what he's saying here. Verse 27. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, or better in the New Revised Standard, the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. During the middle of the 14th, the night of the 14th, after setting sail from Fair Havens on Crete, the ship's crew sensed that the ship was nearing land. This was either because they felt a difference in the swells of the water, or possibly they could hear the waves breaking on an island in the distance. They would shortly discover that they were due south of Italy and Sicily in the Sea of Adria, which is better than Adriatic. It's also called the Sea of Hadria. That was the southernmost extension of the Adriatic Sea into, if you look on the map, into the Adriatic between Macedonia and Italy, comes down, and where the land basically on either side ends, that's where the Adriatic ends. So the Sea of Adria, was the furthest extension of that into the Mediterranean itself, the main part of the Mediterranean going from east to west. Verse 28. So they dropped a plumb line, Complete Jewish Bible has. They dropped a plumb line, or they took soundings, the New King James has, and found the water 120 feet deep. A little farther on, they took another sounding and found it 90 feet. Now, the plumb line was a weighted rope for measuring water depth that was lowered until it hit bottom. It's like in the Mark Twain, Mark Twain. They had the same type of ropes that they used going down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and they would drop it down to see what the water level was, how deep it was to the bottom of the river. Same thing here. Verse 29, then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day, or waited anxiously for daylight to come, Goodspeed has. Since the water was getting more shallow, They had to act quickly to prevent the ship from running aground in the pitch darkness because it's still the middle of the night. Verse 30, Complete Jewish Bible. At this point, the crew made an attempt to abandon ship. They lowered the lifeboat into the sea, pretending that they were about to let out some anchors from the bow. Well, the stern you can understand, that's behind the ship, but to throw out anchors from the bow? These seasoned sailors were afraid to stay on board the ship for another 4 or more hours until there would be light to see. They cared only about saving themselves. They could care less about the prisoners. Verse 31, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." God's promise that all would survive required that the crew use their skills to navigate the ship into the safest beach area. So it was critical that the sailors, the seasoned sailors, stayed on board. Verse 32, then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff or the lifeboat and let it fall off or drift away, Goodspeed has. The soldiers now made absolutely certain that the crew could not again attempt to abandon ship during the night. Verse 33, New American Standard. And until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing." In addition to the intensity of the storm causing seasickness, it also made food preparation, specifically cooking, absolutely impossible. You know, generally they would cook with oil, olive oil or some type of oil in order to cook or bake their bread or whatever, or use coals, charcoal, whatever. But when you've got a ship that's going all over the place, you don't want to fire anywhere on board. So not only was it impossible because of the way they felt being seasick, but there was simply no way to prepare food. Verse 34, Revised English Bible. So, Paul goes on, have something to eat, I beg you. Your lives depend on it. Remember, not a hair of your heads will be lost. Verse 35 from the New King James, and when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Paul spoke to the men encouragingly and prayed to God with great expectation. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. The faith and example of fearlessness of Paul inspired and assured everyone aboard that all was going to be okay. Verse 37, the Complete Jewish Bible. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board the ship. Now, Luke apparently became aware of the total number of passengers and crew, because that's the total, crew and passengers, during the distribution of the food. He hasn't mentioned the total number before, but he does now, because now food is being distributed, so he would have an idea of how many men there were on board. Verse 38, going on in the Complete Jewish Bible, after they had eaten all they wanted, they lightened the ship by dumping the grain, or wheat, the New King James has, into the sea. After regaining strength from eating, everyone worked to lighten the ship so that they would be in as shallow water as possible when it ran aground. The more you throw out, the more the ship will rise. Less weight, the higher you ride. And so they were trying to get as much out so that when they finally did hit land, it wouldn't be, 50 feet out in the ocean, but it would be as shallow as possible. Verse 39, now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, or Goodspeed has the coast. They didn't recognize the coast, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. New Revised Standard has, so they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars, or the rudders, Moffat better has, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. This was the reason Paul said it was necessary for the crew to remain aboard ship. The crew knew exactly what needed to be done. The heavy anchors were cut loose. They simply cut them, let them fall into the sea. The rudder was released. It had been tied down in one position so that it would go straight. Now the rudder was released so that they could actually steer the ship in the direction of the beach. And then the sail, the foresail, the one on the front, was raised so that the wind would provide the increased speed necessary to propel the ship as far up on the beach as possible. They needed all the speed they could get. Now, we do have some pictures that we can show on the internet. I don't think you can see them here, but of St. Paul's Bay. We'll mention that again. But this is basically the location everyone accepts is where this particular event happened. Today, there's city built all around it, but it wasn't then, not like today. All right, verse 41, Revised English Bible. But they found themselves caught between cross currents and ran the ship aground, so that the bow stuck fast and remained immovable, while the stern was being pounded to pieces by the breakers. The cross currents created by an unseen, they created an unseen sandbar. You know, they couldn't see it, but it was just far enough below the water and the choppy water they couldn't see it. And because the sandbar was there, it was hit. The bow hit that sandbar at such speed that there was no hope that the ship would ever dislodge. No way it was going to happen. They hit it, wind pushing it with that sail up, and it went up and it got stuck. The ship then was doomed to being destroyed on the sandbar by these powerful waves that were coming from the stern, from the back of the ship. Verse 42, now the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. Now, as we've seen before, the soldiers were aware that they would be held personally accountable by Rome for any escaped prisoners. And according to Roman law, they would suffer whatever punishments had been decreed for those prisoners. And so the logical thing is, we got to kill them all, because if any of them escape, then we ourselves may be killed. Verse 43, Revised English Bible, but the centurion recognized that determined to bring Paul. The centurion was determined, Revised English Bible, to bring Paul safely through and prevented them from carrying out their plan. So God made absolutely certain that the centurion understood that Paul had been instrumental in saving the lives of everyone on board the ship. So the centurion, because of God's influence, made certain that the soldiers under him didn't carry out their plans. Going on in verse 43, the Revised English Bible, he gave orders that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on parts of the ship, or pieces of wreckage Goodspeed has, and thus it was that all came safely to land. Now these verses seem to indicate that the order was given first of all to the soldiers, not just everybody, but the soldiers. Even though the ship had not reached the beach, it was close enough that the men would be able, those who could swim, would be able to swim and not have that far to go, so they could safely get to the beach. Once they were on the beach, once the soldiers had gotten onto the beach, then they would be able to prevent any of the prisoners from escaping. They go first, prisoners will come later. All right, chapter 28, verse 1, Revised English Bible continues. Once we had made our way to safety, we identified the island as Malta. Again, from the map that we have of the journey of Paul, it shows the crisscrossing back and forth. Nobody knows exactly. I don't know how. It's just guesswork as far as how this happened, but we find Malta, this tiny little dot south of Sicily. So that is where the shipwreck occurred. Again, the most probable location of landing was on the shore of what today is called St. Paul's Bay on the island of Malta. Verse 2, the complete Jewish Bible has, its people, or its natives, showed extraordinary kindness. It was cold, and it had started to rain. So they lit a bonfire and welcomed us all. The New King James goes on in verse 3. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. Now, we know from things we've read in Paul's epistles and things we've seen thus far in the book of Acts that the Apostle Paul considered himself a servant. He did not consider himself the guy that people needed to wait on. He saw himself as one who waited on others. That was his mentality. That was the humility of Paul. And so he went out as a servant to gather sticks when he saw that the fire needed more fuel. He didn't sit there and say, hey, I'm the guy that saved your life, so I'm going to sit here in the warmth of the fire. You guys go out and get it. No. Paul did it himself. Verse 4. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live. The local people were aware that a large percentage of the survivors were prisoners, Roman prisoners, and made the assumption that Paul himself was a criminal, a murderer, and he was just getting exactly the punishment he deserved. He was a murderer, he escaped God. The gods tried to kill him in the shipwreck, and he survived, but, the gods made sure that he got bitten by this viper. Verse 5. But he, Paul, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. Now, you'll remember that the Apostle Paul had been given a commission by Jesus Christ, who promised to protect him while he fulfilled the role that he had been commissioned. It was the same protection that Jesus promised to all of those whom he had selected and commissioned to spread the gospel. Back in Mark chapter 16, verse 17. Mark 16, verse 17. Here Jesus states, and these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents. And if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. Now, when it says take up serpents, we understand that that means just what Paul did. Not trying to hold a rattlesnake, and, kiss its tongue like absolutely insane individuals do as they twist the Scripture. Okay. We also find here in Luke chapter 10, pretty much the same. Luke 10, verse 19. Jesus says, in speaking, when he commissioned the 70, behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. So there's the promise again. He promised protection, and he fulfilled that protection here in Acts chapter 28, verse 5, by protecting Paul. Even though he had been bitten, the poison of the serpent did nothing. Now, verse 6 of chapter 28, however, they were expecting, that is the natives of Malta, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Now, based on what they knew had always happened to those who were bitten by this particular viper, this particular snake, any normal man by this point would have been dead. That's what they knew from their own experience. The fact that Paul suffered no reaction convinced them that he was not a mortal. Now, unlike what happened at Lystra back in chapter 14, when the people, remember, believed that Paul and Barnabas were Greek gods, at that point, they believed that after Paul had healed the crippled man, even though, we know what he did then. He told them, no, we are not God. Luke gives us no further details of how Paul corrected their misunderstanding at this point. We know that he did, obviously, but we just don't have the details. Verse 7, Complete Jewish Bible. Nearby were lands belonging to the governor of the island, whose name was Publius. He received us in a friendly manner and put us up for 3 days. Now, Publius was probably a subordinate of the governor of the province of Sicily, because Malta, as you see here on the map, is a real tiny little island. Sicily is pretty good size, and so Sicily was a province, and therefore the governor of Sicily would probably be over the governor, if you will, of Malta. As the primary Roman official on Malta, Publius was responsible to provide care for the Roman soldiers and their prisoners. He therefore had everyone brought to his estate, where 3 days were needed in order for him to arrange winter lodging for these 276 individuals, some of them prisoners, some of them crew, some of them Roman soldiers. Verse 8, and it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. Since God provided miracles of healing to demonstrate that the message of the gospel was of divine origin, all who came to Paul, and it says from all over the island basically, all who came to him to be healed, no doubt heard the gospel from the Apostle Paul and learned that Paul was not a god, but, as many of them had presumed, but that he represented the true God, the one who could heal diseases. Verse 10, Complete Jewish Bible. They heaped honors on us, Luke says, and when the time came for us to sail, they provided the supplies we needed. Now, despite spending 3 months on this island of Malta, Luke only recorded these very few details here in these couple of verses. He did it to show that God blessed their stay while on the island. But you can imagine, in 3 months, Paul did a lot of speaking. There were a lot of things done, but it's not Luke's purpose to give us a catalog of everything that happened. Verse 11. Let's see, New American Standard. And at the end of 3 months, we set sail. Now, according to first century writers, the earliest navigation of the Mediterranean after winter was never before the first week in February. That's what they write. So the shipwreck survivors probably left Malta by mid-February. Sometime mid-February or a little bit after is when they finally set sail. Verse 11 goes on in the New American Standard. We set sail on an Alexandrian ship which had wintered at the island and which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. The cargo ship, this particular one that they were able to board, spent the winter in the harbor of Valletta, V-A-L-E-T-T-A. Valletta was the town that had a harbor large enough for these grain ships. In Greek mythology, the twin brothers were the sons of Zeus. Their names were Castor and Pollux, which, by the way, are the 2 brightest stars in the constellation Gemini, which we know Gemini means the twins. Sailors believed that the Gemini, the twin brothers, were a sign of good fortune in stormy seas. So you can see why they would want to name their ship as such. Verse 12, and landing at Syracuse. So looking again at the map, we see from Malta, there's this little S passage up to Syracuse, which is on the southeast coast of Sicily. It required sailing about 80 miles from Valletta on Malta. They spent 3 days in the harbor, either to unload or to load cargo, and then wait for more favorable winds to continue northward. Verse 13 goes on, from there we circled round and reached Rhegium, or we arrived at Rhegium by tacking, better in the complete Jewish Bible. And after 1 day, the south wind blew. So we see Rhegium here, which is, from Syracuse, they had to tack against a northwest wind. The wind was coming from the northwest, and for those who have been out on sailboats, you know how to tack. You go into the wind, you have to turn the sail this way and that, and you can actually make headway even though the wind is against you. But it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And so they tacked all the way to the entrance of the Strait of Messina, which is right between the toe of Italy here and the northeastern corner of Sicily. There, they had to harbor at Rhegium until the wind changed direction, which it did a day later. All right, going on in verse 13, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren. Now, Puteoli was the primary seaport for Rome, the city of Rome itself, where the grain ships from Egypt unloaded. And from there, it went north overland rather than continuing up the coast and have to cut back over. Rome is not on the coast. It's miles inland. And so the easiest way in order to get the grain was to take it overland from Puteoli. Due to its commercial importance, Puteoli's population at that time was around 100,000 people. It had also a very large Jewish community in Puteoli, which included followers of the way, Christians, Nazarenes, as they would be called. Some of the believers in Puteoli may have been among the Jews from Rome who had come to Jerusalem for Pentecost in AD 30, who are mentioned back in chapter 2, verses 10 or 11 of Acts. There were Jews who came from Rome. Or these could have been Jews who had been called when visiting Jerusalem at festivals in subsequent years. Or they could have heard and believed the gospel when traveling through other areas of the Roman Empire where congregations had been established. Or they had come to the faith through believing brethren who had either passed through or who had settled in Puteoli. At any rate, there were brethren there, Paul mentions. And, verse 14 goes on, were invited to stay with them 7 days. The centurion Julius, as we know his name was, must have had either military responsibilities or some type of business responsibility that required him to spend a week in Puteoli before escorting whichever prisoners were to be taken all the way to Rome, which still lay about 100 miles to the northwest of Puteoli. During that time, he probably allowed Paul this privilege of freedom because he realized the role Paul had in saving not only his life, but everybody who was on the ship. And so, okay, Paul, I've got to stay here. You've got brethren, you can go. Verse 14. And so we went toward Rome. That is after the 7 days. So after spending a week in Puteoli, Julius set out for Rome with Paul and Luke, probably Aristarchus, and the rest of the group of prisoners that he was to escort under military guard. Verse 15, and from there, when the brethren heard about us, that is, the brethren from Rome, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum, or the market of Appius, the New American Standard has, and 3 inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage, or he was greatly encouraged, Goodspeed says. Now, you look on the Roman map, you see where Puteoli is, and then you have the road that goes up from there to the Forum of Appius, to the Three Taverns, and then ultimately to Rome. In order for the brethren who lived in Rome to be made aware of Paul's coming, they had to have been informed. How would they know? Okay, well, hey, I believe Paul's coming. Why don't we go down and meet him? No, that didn't just hit them and dawn on them that way. They had to have been informed. Either Paul had sent a letter, or Aristarchus shortly after reaching Puteoli, or most likely one of the brethren from Puteoli took off from Puteoli and went personally to Rome, where he would know a number of the members in Rome and give them the news. Some of the brethren from Rome were able to leave earlier than others and traveled over 40 miles in order to meet Paul at the market of Appius. A second group had to have left later because they met him about 30 miles from Rome at the village of Three Inns, or Three Taverns as it is here on the map. Paul was greatly encouraged because he was finally able to fulfill his desire to reach the brethren in Rome, which he had expressed in the letter that he had written to them some 3 years earlier. That was when the Epistle of Romans was written. Verse 16, now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard. Now, the captain of the guard was actually the general who commanded the Praetorian Guard that was stationed at the palace to protect the emperor. That's who the captain of the guard is here. But Paul was permitted to dwell by himself. So we find here that Paul was given liberty to take an apartment rather than be confined with others awaiting trials or sentencing, the other prisoners. So Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. Now, there was not just one soldier who stayed with him permanently. We shouldn't get that idea. Multiple soldiers served in shifts, different ones at different times. Okay, according to what Paul wrote later in Philippians, Philippians 1 verses 12 and 13. According to what he wrote in Philippians 1 verses 12 and 13, over time the entire Praetorian Guard had come to know Paul. Now, how is it that they all came to know him? Because they all, different ones, had shifts to be there with him. And so they all knew Paul. Verse 17 goes on in the New King James, and it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called, or he invited, Goodspeed has, the leaders of the Jews together. Paul's practice had always been to go first to the Jews before taking the gospel to the Gentiles. When he was a free man, the first place he went when he entered into a town, a village, a city, was to the synagogue. Remember what we've seen thus far all through the book of Acts? First place he would go, synagogue. Since he did not have that freedom in Rome, he invited the leaders of the synagogues to come to him because there were multiple synagogues, a city the size of Rome. So he invited them to come to him. According to the Encyclopedia Judaica, in volume 14, on page 242, there were at least 10,000 Jews living in Rome at that time. 10,000. So that would have made a significant number of synagogues, considerable number of rulers of the synagogues. Verse 17 goes on, so when they had come together, he said to them, men and brethren, though I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go, because there was no cause for putting me to death. Paul began addressing them by explaining that his present circumstances of being confined to this apartment, this dwelling in Rome, were not due. His circumstances were not due to any criminal or seditious activity on his part. In fact, the primary leaders of the Eastern Roman Empire, the governor of Judea, who was Festus, and King Agrippa, those were the two primary in the Eastern Roman Empire. Both of them agreed that he should be set free. Back in chapter 16. Both said, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we could just let him go. Verse 19, New Living Translation. But when the Jewish leaders protested the decision, I felt it necessary to appeal to Caesar, even though I had no desire to press charges against my own people. Paul says that his reason for appealing to Caesar was not to redirect blame against any of the Jews, but solely to have the opportunity to defend himself before an impartial judge. That's the reason I had to do this, Paul says. Verse 20, New King James again. For this reason, therefore, I have called for you, to see you and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. After giving a quick summary of why he was a prisoner, he told the leaders of the Jews of Rome that the catalyst of the charges against him by the Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem was what he taught concerning the prophesied Messiah, who was the hope of all of the descendants of Israel. All of Israel was looking for the coming of Messiah. And they said to him, we neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any of the brethren who came reported or spoken any evil of you. Now, there are two possible reasons why no word had yet reached these synagogue leaders in Rome concerning Paul. Number one, since Paul was probably on the last ship that left Caesarea before navigation to Rome was closed due to winter seas, there had not been enough time for any correspondence or travelers from Judea to, by this point, reach Rome. So it would be impossible because of the time frame of winter and travel. Secondly, the other possible reason, probably the most likely, the leaders of the Sanhedrin may have decided that since none of the Roman officials and representatives stationed in Judea had judged Paul guilty, then how in the world could they expect a different outcome from a trial in Rome itself? We couldn't even get it done here. How in the world would we get it done in Rome? And so, probably didn't send anyone at all. In fact, that's what seems to happen. Verse 22, but we desire to hear from you what you think. This is what the Jewish religious leaders in Rome asked. For concerning this sect, we know that it is spoken against everywhere. We know about what you're talking about. We haven't heard that much about you, but we have heard the word. They admitted here to having heard that many Jews throughout the empire were opposed to the sect of the Nazarenes or the Christians. They knew that, but they were still willing to hear the things that Paul had taught, so that he had taught that had so upset the religious leaders in Jerusalem at the Sanhedrin. Verse 23, so when they had appointed him a day, many came to him at his lodging, to whom he explained and solemnly testified of the kingdom of God, persuading, or Goodspeed has, trying to convince them concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets from morning till evening. This meeting indicates that Paul's lodging, it wasn't, just a small little cubby hole here in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't an efficiency apartment whatsoever. Because it says, many came to him at his lodging. This shows us that his lodging was spacious. Since his message lasted throughout the day, that's what it says here, from morning till evening, he probably greatly expanded on the content of the witness that he had delivered in Antioch of Pisidia. Back in chapter 13, he started at the beginning and it went all through, and same thing here. He no doubt went through multiple, because it says from the law of Moses and the prophets. He went through prophecy after prophecy, developing everything and then tying it all in to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Verse 24, and some were persuaded by the things which were spoken, and some disbelieved, or some remained unconvinced, the Revised English Bible has. The exact ratio of believers to unbelievers is not given here, so we don't know. Only those selected by the Father, John 6:44, had their minds open to comprehend the truths that Paul presented them. Unless God, the Father, opens the mind, then it won't register. But he obviously did to some of them. Was it half? Was it more than half? We're not told. Verse 25. So, when they did not agree among themselves, they departed. After Paul had said one word, or Complete Jewish Bible better has here, after Paul made one final statement. Quote, the Holy Spirit spoke rightly through Isaiah the prophet to our fathers, saying, go to this people and say, hearing you will hear, and shall not understand, and seeing you will see, and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts, and turn, so that I should heal them. Paul refers here to Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10. He refers to this as a final exhortation and warning to the Jewish synagogue leaders who refused to accept Jesus as the fulfillment of the Messianic prophecies. He says, you are the ones that Isaiah is talking about. You've got ears to hear, you got eyes to see, and yet you refuse to do so. Therefore, verse 28, let it be known to you that the salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will hear it. Paul had delivered the message of salvation to the Jews in Rome. Now, he would do as he was commissioned by Jesus, the resurrected Messiah, on the road to Damascus. He would now present the gospel to the Gentiles. That would be his primary thrust. And when he had said these words, the Jews departed and had a great dispute among themselves. Those who were believers of the synagogue leaders insisted that they would teach in the synagogues that they were rulers over. They would teach the message that Paul had given to those who attended the synagogues that they represented, while the disbelievers intended to suppress that. We're not going to spread this around. We don't agree with it. We're not going to bring this up. And so they disputed among themselves. Verse 30. Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence. No one forbidding him, or as the New Revised Standard has here, with all boldness and without hindrance. In other words, he was left to do as he wished. For 2 years, AD 59 to 61, while he waited for his trial before Nero, Paul taught both Jews, it says here, both Jews and Gentiles. He received all who came. So there were Jews who came, there were Gentiles who came. He taught all who had heard about Paul and about his teaching, who were moved to come to Paul and learn. For 2 years he did this. Now, Roman law required prosecutors to appear within a year and a half, 18 months. Prosecutors had to show up within 18 months. If they failed to do so, their charges that they had made, would be dismissed and the defendant would be set free. So, it says here, he was 2 whole years. Since Paul spent 2 full years without going to trial, it seems that the Sanhedrin never sent a prosecutor, which means Paul is simply released. He did not go before Nero at that particular time. It was during this time, this 2-year period, 59 to 61, that he wrote 4 of the letters contained in the New Testament: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Those are the ones. In each of those, he referred to being in chains. And here in Ephesians chapter 6, Ephesians 6, verse 19, Complete Jewish Bible has, he wrote, "Pray for me too, that whenever I open my mouth, the words will be given to me to be bold in making known the secret of the good news, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may speak boldly the way I should." Clearly, this was during the time of his first Roman imprisonment. In Colossians, chapter 4, verse 3, "Meanwhile, praying also for us that God would open to us a door for the word, to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak." In Philippians, chapter 1, verse 13, Complete Jewish Bible, "It has become clear to the whole palace," or the whole palace guard, King James, New King James, "and to everyone else, that it is because of the Messiah that I am in chains." The whole palace guard, all of the Praetorian Guard, was aware. Here in chapter 4 of Philippians, verse 22, "All the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household." He was still in Rome. He was still confined. In Philemon, verse 1, "Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our beloved friend and fellow laborer." Skipping down here to verse 10, "I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains." So here we have 4 letters that he wrote during that period of time. Now, at the end of the 2 years, in AD 61, Paul regained his freedom. Since God had told him in the vision before the shipwreck that he would be required to appear before Caesar. That was back here in chapter 27, verse 24. He told him, "You're going to have to appear before Caesar." He may have done so, may have at that time, but it's much more likely that he was brought before Nero 6 or 7 years later, shortly before he was put to death in either AD 67 or 68. That date, different ones have it different ways, 67 or 68. Now, upon his release in 61, Paul probably sailed to Spain, as he had earlier indicated his intention in chapter 15 of Romans. From there, he also went to the British Isles. There's considerable evidence to that end. He could have spent as much as 5 or 6 years in the western part of the Roman Empire. After concluding his ministry in the West, Paul probably returned to Rome and then headed east. Apparently, we have a map, a different map, of what happens in the east now. He probably then headed east, apparently stopping first at Crete, as this map shows. And he does that in order to visit with Titus, because we find in Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul is there with him. So that's the only time frame. It has to be after he was released from Roman imprisonment, but not too long before he was apprehended. All right, he likely went from Crete to Ephesus, where he encountered the problems of which he wrote in his second letter to Timothy. He left Timothy in Ephesus in order to take care of some of those problems. And after doing so, he seems to have gone first to Miletus, which is south of Ephesus, where he left Trophimus. He mentions Trophimus in 2 Timothy 4, I think verse 20, because Trophimus became very sick and he couldn't travel. And so Paul left him at Miletus, and then he went north. He probably took sail. He probably sailed north, then to Troas, where he left either his heavy cloak, as it's translated in most translations, which would be an indication it was summertime, because he wouldn't need a heavy cloak, or more likely, as we've covered before, it wasn't a cloak at all, but a protective case that contained the scrolls that were copies of all of his letters. And he took those and left them at Troas with Carpus, we're told in 2 Timothy 4:13. And he did that and then left and sailed west back to Macedonia. And he probably went first of all to Philippi, and then he worked his way down through Macedonia from Philippi, probably went to Thessalonica, Berea, and went all the way down to Corinth. Now, at some point during that trip, coming down to Corinth, he apparently wrote on the way, or whatever, he sent his letter to Titus, in which Paul asked Titus to come to him in Nicopolis, which is, again, on the map, the west side of Macedonia, where Paul was intending to spend the winter of either AD 66-67 or AD 67-68, according to Titus chapter 3, verse 12. It was also during this time that he wrote his first letter to Timothy, letter we call 1 Timothy. While he was, Timothy was still in Ephesus, so he wrote Titus down in Crete. He wrote Timothy, who was in Ephesus, and he got those probably mailed, if you will, in Corinth. And so those letters went out while he was in Corinth. Now, sometime after sending those two letters, Paul was arrested and he was taken back to Rome. If he was able to proceed with his plan to arrive in Nicopolis before winter, he may have been arrested at Nicopolis. After all, Paul was imprisoned in Rome, according to what we read in 2 Timothy 4, prior to winter. So it was prior to winter when he was, again, back in Rome, in prison. And he didn't have his own apartment anymore, didn't have his own lodging anymore. He was confined. Now, it was shortly after starting this time of confinement, the second confinement in Rome, that he wrote his letter to the Judean Christians, the letter we call Hebrews, Because in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 18 and 19, and in verse 24, he makes reference to not only being in bondage, if you will, but also the fact that when he was released, he's going to come see him. Now, that was what he thought at that point. That was toward the beginning of this second confinement. But later, once he realized that he would never be released, that this was it, he wrote his final letter to Timothy, asking him to come and to bring John Mark with him. Again, 2 Timothy chapter 4, is where we have that information. According to tradition, since Paul was a Roman citizen, his manner of death was beheading by order of Nero. Now, the book of Acts is one of 3 books in the New Testament that does not end with an amen. James and 3 John are the other 2. This indicates that they're not finished and indicates that there may be yet more added to the story in the book of Acts. Now, there's a spurious chapter 29 of Acts, which may have some reality to it, but it is bogus because there's no way that Paul ever extended a hand of friendship to Druid priests, which is in Acts 29. So if you don't take Acts 29 with even a grain of salt, but there are some things in it that could be accurate, certainly not that part. So that brings us to the close of Acts, and we'll figure out what we'll do next shortly.